I didn't know a single sentence could make time slow down like that, but the moment it happened, everything felt heavier, like the air itself had decided to sit down and listen. Ha ha ha. Funny how silence can feel loud, isn't it? We were all there, sitting close enough to hear each other breathe, close enough to feel warmth, and yet somehow I had never felt more alone in that room. I remember thinking, this is just another family talk, one of those awkward ones where everyone pretends to be calm while their thoughts run wild. Sighed, but then he looked straight at me, not angry, not even emotional, just firm, like he'd practiced it in his head 100 times, and when he spoke, it wasn't the words that shocked me first, it was how easy they came out of his mouth. No shaking voice, no hesitation, just certainty. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake or a burst of anger. This was something he'd been carrying for a while. The room went so quiet that I could hear someone swallow. Maybe it was me, maybe it was someone else, I don't know. My hands felt cold even though it wasn't cold at all, and for a second I wondered if I should say something, anything, just to prove I was still there, still alive in that moment. But I didn't. I sat still. I breathed in slowly. And I listened. You see, people think silence means weakness, but sometimes silence is the moment you decide to really see someone for who they are. As he spoke, I noticed things I had never paid attention to before, the way his eyes didn't soften, the way his shoulders stayed relaxed, like this wasn't hard for him at all. That hurt more than the words themselves, because when your own child talks to you like that, you don't just hear sound, you hear years, you hear memories, you hear every late night, every quiet prayer, every time you chose them over yourself. I felt a laugh almost escape my throat, a sad little ha-ha-ha, because part of me couldn't believe this was happening, like maybe this was some strange joke that would end any second. But it didn't. He kept talking. And the more he talked, the clearer it became that he thought this moment was about power, about drawing a line, about telling me where I stood. What he didn't realize was that I had already stopped standing in that place a long time ago. I remember looking around and seeing faces frozen in shock, eyes glued to the floor, nobody daring to interrupt, because when someone says words like that, nobody wants to be the one who breaks the silence. I felt a tightness in my chest, not the kind that makes you cry, but the kind that makes you tired, deep in your bones, sigh, the kind that says, so this is how it ends. But it wasn't ending, not clearly, not yet. Something inside me shifted, quietly, like a door closing without a sound. I realized I wasn't listening to argue or defend myself. I was listening to understand how he had arrived here. Every sentence he spoke felt like another piece of a puzzle clicking into place, and with each click my heart felt heavier but my mind felt clearer. Isn't that strange? Pain bringing clarity. I thought about interrupting him, about saying his name the way I used to when he was younger, the way that used to make him look up at me without even thinking. But I didn't. I let him speak. I let him say everything he thought he needed to say, even when my throat burned and my eyes stung and I had to blink slowly to keep the tears from spilling over. I wasn't calm because I didn't care. I was calm because I cared too much to turn this into a fight he thought he could win. As he spoke, I felt memories rise up without warning, him laughing as a child, him running toward me without fear, him calling me when he was scared or unsure, and each memory felt like a quiet question asking, when did this change? I wanted to ask him that, I really did, but I knew the answer wouldn't come from his mouth. It would come from watching what happened next. So I stayed quiet. I nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acceptance of the moment. Acceptance doesn't mean approval, by the way, and that's something people often forget. Acceptance just means you stop fighting reality and start preparing for what comes after. He thought my silence meant he had won, and I could almost feel his confidence grow with each word, like he was building himself up on the idea that I had nothing left to say. If only he knew, if only he understood that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't anger or tears, but patience. The room stayed still, and I could feel everyone waiting for me to explode, to cry, to beg, to say something dramatic. But I didn't give them that. I gave them silence. I gave them calm. And in that calm, I made a quiet promise to myself that whatever happened next, I would not lose my dignity. Because when someone tells you that you're no longer family, the worst thing you can do is forget who you are. I sat there, breathing evenly, listening carefully, letting every word sink in because I wanted to remember this moment clearly, not through anger or pain, but through truth. And as he continued speaking, unaware of what was forming in my mind, I realized something important, something that made my chest ache and my lips almost smile at the same time. Sometimes the moment someone pushes you away is the moment they give you the clearest view of who they've become. And I kept listening, not knowing yet how this would end, but knowing deep inside that letting him finish was only the beginning. He didn't stop after that first sentence, and honestly, I think that surprised me more than the sentence itself. Because once you say something like that, most people pause, they wait for a reaction, they brace themselves for tears or shouting, ha ha ha, but he didn't wait at all. He just kept going, like he was finally reading from a script he'd been rehearsing in his head for months. His voice stayed steady, almost polite, and that made it worse somehow, sigh, because anger I could understand, but this calm felt distant, calculated. He started explaining himself, talking about boundaries, about how things had changed, about how he needed to protect his own peace. And I remember thinking how strange it sounded hearing those words come from someone I once held when they couldn't even say a full sentence. I watched his mouth move and tried to focus on the meaning instead of the sting, telling myself, just listen, because I wanted to know what story he was telling himself to make this feel right. As he talked, I noticed how he avoided certain words, how he never once said he was hurt or confused, only that he was done, and that told me more than anything else. People who are hurting usually don't sound so sure. People who are trying to convince themselves do. I felt a soft pressure behind my eyes, the kind that comes right before tears, and I let out a quiet breath through my nose, hoping no one noticed, because the room was still frozen, everyone trapped in that strange space where nobody knows where to look. I could feel their eyes on me even when I wasn't looking at them, waiting for me to interrupt, to defend myself, to remind him of everything I had done, but I didn't want to give him that power. I wanted him to keep talking because with every sentence he was revealing something, not about me, but about himself. He spoke about independence like it was something new he had just discovered, like it hadn't been the very thing I'd always wanted for him, and that almost made me smile in a sad way, ha ha ha. Because isn't it funny how children sometimes think their freedom is a rebellion against the people who taught them how to stand in the first place? I listened as he listed reasons that sounded strong on the surface but felt hollow underneath, like furniture that looks solid until you lean on it. He mentioned things I'd said years ago, moments taken out of context, and I realized then how long he'd been collecting these thoughts, stacking them up quietly until they felt heavy enough to drop all at once. There was a moment when he glanced around the room, maybe checking to see if anyone disagreed with him, and nobody did, not because they agreed, but because nobody wanted to step into the fire. I don't blame them. Silence spreads easily in moments like that. I nodded once, slowly, not to encourage him, but to let him know I was still listening, still present, and that seemed to give him permission to go even further. He talked about respect, about how he felt judged, about how he was tired of feeling like he owed something just because we were family, and that word owed landed hard in my chest, sigh, because love was never meant to feel like a debt. I wanted to tell him that, to explain that everything I did was a choice, not a transaction, but I held my tongue. I could feel my heart beating steadily, slower than I expected, and that scared me a little because it meant something inside me had already accepted that this conversation was changing things forever. As he continued, I started noticing small details, the way his foot tapped slightly, the way he kept clearing his throat, tiny signs that all this confidence wasn't as solid as it seemed, and that's when I understood why staying quiet mattered. If I had interrupted him, he could have blamed me for not listening. If I had argued, he could have painted himself as the victim. But by letting him speak freely, I was giving him space to show exactly who he was in this moment, without interruption, without excuses. There was a strange calm that settled over me as he talked, a calm mixed with sadness, like standing on the shore watching a boat drift farther away, knowing you can't swim after it even if you wanted to. I felt my hands relax in my lap, my shoulders drop, and I realized I wasn't holding my breath anymore. That's when it hit me, softly but clearly. He thought this conversation was about cutting ties, but for me, it was about seeing the truth without filters. He finally slowed down, his words coming less quickly, as if he was reaching the end of what he'd prepared to say, and I could sense him waiting for something, a reaction, a plea, maybe even an apology. I gave him none of that. I just looked at him calmly, quietly, and kept listening. Because the more he talked, the more certain I became that he didn't yet understand the weight of what he was saying, and that sooner or later he would. And as he took a breath, thinking he had said everything that mattered, I realized he was still missing something important, something he hadn't considered at all, and that realization stayed with me, heavy and patient, waiting for the right moment to surface. As he kept talking, my mind started drifting in a way I didn't expect, not away from the room but backward through time, like memories had been waiting for a quiet moment to rise up, sigh, and suddenly I wasn't just hearing his voice anymore, I was hearing echoes of a much younger one, softer, unsure, calling my name in the middle of the night because he'd had a bad dream. It's strange how the mind works, ha ha ha, how it chooses the most inconvenient moments to remind you of everything you once were to someone. I remembered mornings that started too early when the world was still dark and quiet, and I was already awake, packing lunches, ironing clothes, telling myself I'd rest later, always later. I remembered standing in doorways watching him sleep, just for a second longer than necessary, because something about that peaceful face made the tiredness feel worth it. None of those memories felt dramatic back then. They felt normal. Ordinary, that's the dangerous part, I think. You don't realize you're building a whole life for someone until one day they tell you they don't need it anymore. As he spoke about moving on and drawing lines, my chest tightened not from anger but from a deep, slow ache, the kind that comes when you realize how invisible effort can be once it becomes routine. I thought about all the times I stayed quiet before, choosing peace over being right, choosing his comfort over my pride, and I wondered when that silence had stopped being understood as love and started being mistaken for weakness. There were moments I almost laughed softly, a shaky ha-ha-ha, because some of the things he listed as burdens were things I'd never once thought of as sacrifices. They were just part of loving someone. You don't keep score when you love like that, or at least I didn't. As my thoughts wandered, I remembered the first time he disappointed me, really disappointed me, and how quickly I'd pushed that feeling aside because he was learning, because everyone makes mistakes, because that's what parents are supposed to do. I remembered defending him when others criticized him, finding excuses for behavior that made me uneasy, telling myself he'd grow out of it, that life would soften him the way it had softened me. Sitting there now, listening to him explain why I no longer belonged in his life, I felt a quiet realization settle in, heavy but honest. Maybe I had protected him so well from consequences that he never learned what words could do. That thought hurt more than I expected, sigh, because it meant accepting that love, when it's too forgiving, can sometimes shape a person in ways you never intended. I looked at his face again, really looked, and tried to find traces of the boy I remembered, the one who used to look at me like I was the safest place in the world. There were pieces of him still there, I could tell, but they were buried under confidence, under borrowed phrases, under a version of strength that hadn't yet been tested by loss. I wondered when he'd stopped asking for my advice and started seeing it as interference, when my concern had turned into control in his mind, and I realized there was no single moment I could point to. Change like that doesn't happen loudly. It happens quietly over years through misunderstandings that never get cleared up and feelings that never get named. As he paused between sentences, I felt my throat tight and I swallowed hard, keeping my expression neutral even as a tear escaped and slid down slowly, unnoticed, or maybe noticed but politely ignored. Nobody said anything, nobody moved. It felt like the whole room was holding its breath, waiting for me to break, and part of me wanted to cry openly, to let everyone see how much this hurt, but another part of me knew that wouldn't change anything. Pain doesn't always soften people. Sometimes it just confirms what they already believe. I let my thoughts continue, remembering the times I'd felt lonely even when surrounded by family, the moments I'd brushed aside my own needs because there was always something more important, someone else who needed me more. I hadn't resented it then, I truly hadn't, but sitting there now I allowed myself just for a moment to feel the weight of it all without judgment. No anger, no blame, just truth. I realized that love doesn't disappear suddenly. It erodes slowly when it isn't seen, when it isn't acknowledged, when it becomes expected instead of appreciated. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me tired in a deep, honest way, like finally setting down a heavy bag you didn't realize you'd been carrying for years. I listened to him talk about his future, about his plans, about how this decision was best for everyone, and I noticed how his version of everyone didn't include me as a person, only as a problem to be solved. That stung, but it also clarified something important. He wasn't rejecting me because I had failed him. He was rejecting a role he no longer wanted to acknowledge. And roles, once rejected, leave a strange emptiness behind. As these thoughts settled, I felt a quiet resolve growing inside me, not loud or dramatic, just steady. I understood then that this moment wasn't only about what he was taking away from me, but about what I had already given, freely, without condition, and how that gift didn't lose its value just because someone chose not to see it anymore. I kept listening, letting him finish his thoughts, letting my memories pass through me like a slow tide, knowing that something fundamental had shifted, not just between us but within me. And as I sat there, calm on the outside and full on the inside, I sensed that the hardest part of this story wasn't behind me yet, and that what came next would test not just our relationship, but everything I believed about family, love, and the quiet strength it takes to let go without losing yourself. Somewhere in the middle of his words, I became very aware of my own stillness, like my body had decided on its own that moving or speaking would only make things worse, sigh, and that's when I realized something important. I wasn't quiet because I was afraid, I was quiet because I was choosing not to give this moment more chaos than it already had. People often think silence is empty, but silence can be full of decisions. I felt them stacking inside me, one after another, calm and heavy. I decided I would not beg. I decided I would not remind him of sacrifices like a list of debts. I decided I would not cry in a way that made him feel powerful, and that decision, oddly enough, made me feel stronger than any argument ever could. As he continued, I could feel the urge to speak rise and fall like a wave, ha. Every time he said something unfair or incomplete, the words rushed to my lips, ready to defend me, ready to explain, ready to fix things the way I always had. But I let the wave pass. I sat there and listened to my own breathing, slow and steady, because I knew that if I spoke from that place of old habit, I would only repeat the same pattern that brought us here in the first place. There was a strange clarity in that moment, like seeing a picture come into focus after years of blur. I saw how often I had filled silence before, smoothing things over, apologizing even when I didn't fully understand what I'd done wrong, just to keep peace. And I wondered quietly when peace had started costing me pieces of myself. I felt a soft pressure in my chest, not sharp, not explosive, just a dull awareness of loss, the loss of a version of us that no longer existed. As he spoke, I studied his tone more than his words, noticing how certain he sounded, how final, and I realized he wasn't looking for a conversation at all. He was delivering a conclusion. And you don't interrupt someone when they're revealing their conclusion because that's when the truth slips out most clearly. My silence wasn't passive, it was observant. I was watching, learning, understanding the shape of the distance between us. I noticed how he avoided looking directly at me now, how his confidence seemed to rely on not seeing my face too clearly, and that told me something important too. Part of him knew this wasn't kind. He just didn't know how to stop once he'd started. I felt a faint, sad smile touch my lips for a second, a private one, because I suddenly understood that this moment wasn't about convincing him of my worth. My worth didn't need defending. This moment was about letting him fully step into the choice he was making, without interference, without rescue. There's a strange kind of respect in that, even when it hurts. I thought about how often I'd stepped in before, softening his landings, fixing problems quietly so he wouldn't feel the weight of his decisions, and sitting there now, I knew that if I spoke, I'd probably do it again. Old habits don't die easily, so I stayed silent, letting that habit finally rest. I felt a tear gather and slide down, slow and warm, and I didn't wipe it away right away. Not as a show, but because I didn't feel the need to hide it either. This wasn't weakness. This was grief, clean and honest. Nobody said anything. The silence stretched, and instead of panicking, I settled into it. I could almost hear my own thoughts echoing, reminding me that love doesn't mean erasing yourself to make someone else comfortable. Love also means knowing when to stop speaking so someone can hear themselves clearly. As he talked about moving forward, about closing chapters, I realized how little he understood about endings. Endings aren't loud most of the time. They're quiet. They arrive gently, disguised as conversations, dressed up as boundaries and explanations. And once they arrive, you don't chase them. You let them pass through you, leaving behind whatever truth they carry. I felt my shoulders relax even more, my hands resting loosely, my body accepting what my heart was still catching up to. I wasn't numb, I was present, and that presence felt like a form of self-respect I had neglected for too long. I could feel the room waiting, almost leaning toward me, expecting a reaction, but I refused to perform my pain for anyone. Pain doesn't need an audience, it just needs space. As he slowed again, searching for words, I understood that my silence was unsettling him more than any argument would have. He didn't know how to read it. He didn't know if it meant agreement, indifference, or something else entirely. And that uncertainty, I realized, was not my responsibility to clear up. For once, I didn't owe clarity. I owed honesty to myself. I stayed quiet because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone fully reveal who they are, without trying to reshape them in the middle of it. I stayed quiet because I needed to hear not just what he said, but what he believed. And as he finally reached another pause, longer this time, I sensed that the real turning point was getting closer, because he was about to say something he hadn't planned, something that would show me exactly how far he thought this decision went, and whether he understood what it truly meant. By the time he reached the part where he started talking about his independence, I could almost predict the words before they came out, not because I was controlling the moment, but because I'd heard versions of this speech before, just not from him. He spoke about standing on his own, about not needing support anymore, about finally being free to live life his way, and I listened carefully, noticing how proud he sounded, how sure of himself, like someone who believes the ground beneath them is solid without ever checking what it's made of. There was a quiet irony in it that made me let out a small, almost silent ha-ha-ha, because independence doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's built, slowly, brick by brick. And most people forget to look back at who handed them the first tools. As he spoke, I realized he truly believed he had already crossed the finish line, that whatever he had now was entirely his, earned without help, without safety nets, without unseen hands steadying him along the way. I didn't interrupt him to remind him of anything. I didn't mention the times I'd stayed awake worrying, or the choices I'd made quietly so he wouldn't have to. I didn't bring up the support he'd grown used to, the kind that's so constant you stop noticing it, like air. Instead, I watched his confidence closely, the way he leaned into his words, the way his voice lifted slightly when he talked about not owing anyone anything anymore. That word came back again, owing, and it sat heavy in my chest, all because he had turned connection into a burden in his mind, something to escape from rather than something to stand on. I wondered when he decided that strength meant cutting ties instead of understanding them. He talked about how this decision was necessary for his growth, how keeping distance was healthy, how he needed space to become who he was meant to be, and I nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition of a familiar belief. Many people think growth only happens away from where you started, and sometimes that's true. But growth that denies its roots often struggles to stand when the wind changes. I could hear him building his case carefully, stacking logic on top of logic, and from the outside it probably sounded convincing. But listening from where I sat, it felt incomplete, like a story missing its first chapter. He spoke as if the present moment existed on its own, disconnected from everything that came before it, and that told me how he was protecting himself from guilt. It's easier to feel strong when you pretend you arrived alone. I felt a slow sadness move through me, not sharp, not overwhelming, just steady, like a long exhale after holding your breath for too long. I wasn't offended by his belief in himself. I was saddened by how narrow that belief had become. I watched his face as he talked, looking for cracks, for hesitation, for some sign that he understood this confidence came with risks, but he looked calm, assured, almost relieved, like he'd finally said something he'd been holding back. That relief told me something important. He thought this conversation was freeing him. He didn't see it as taking something away from me, he saw it as giving something to himself. And that's when I realized how differently we were viewing the same moment. For him, this was a declaration of strength. For me, it was a quiet warning, because people who believe they no longer need anything are often the least prepared for the moment they do. I felt my hands tighten briefly, then relax again, and I took another slow breath, grounding myself in the present. I wasn't angry, I wasn't even surprised anymore. I was attentive. I listened to how he described his future, confident and clean, free of complications, and I noticed how little room there was in it for uncertainty. Life rarely respects plans like that. I wanted to tell him that independence doesn't mean the absence of support, it means choosing how and when to accept it, but I kept that thought to myself. He wasn't ready to hear it. Right now, he needed to believe in his version of strength, and I needed to let him. There was a strange calm in realizing that I didn't have to correct him, didn't have to guide him, didn't have to protect him from the consequences of his beliefs. That role, the one I'd lived in for so long, was quietly slipping away. I felt a mixture of grief and relief settle in my chest, a confusing blend that made my eyes sting for a moment, sigh, because letting go of responsibility can hurt even when it's necessary. As he finished this part of his speech, I could sense a subtle shift in his tone, like he expected acknowledgement, maybe even admiration, for the way he'd framed his independence. I gave him none of that. I stayed still, steady, present. And in that stillness, I became very aware of something he hadn't mentioned at all, something he seemed to believe was already behind him, something that in reality was still very much a part of his life. That realization didn't rush me, it waited. And as he took another breath, convinced he had made his position clear, I knew the story was moving toward a moment where confidence would meet reality, and the outcome would surprise him far more than it surprised me. As his words settled into the room, I felt something shift inside me, not suddenly, not dramatically, but clearly, like a thought finally stepping into the light after waiting patiently in the corner. Sigh, it was the thing he hadn't mentioned at all. Not once, and the more he talked about being free, about standing alone, about not needing anyone, the louder that absence became. He spoke as if everything supporting him had already disappeared, as if the ground beneath his feet was solid and permanent, and I realized he truly believed that. That belief wasn't arrogance exactly, it was assumption, the kind that forms when support is so consistent you stop seeing it as support and start seeing it as reality itself. I listened carefully, my face calm, my body still, while my mind gently traced the outline of that missing piece. I didn't rush it, I didn't feel the need to correct him, I just observed. There was a quiet, almost painful irony in knowing something so important while the other person spoke with such confidence. Ha, like watching someone pack for a long journey and forget the one thing they'll need most. He talked about how he had things handled now, how his life was settled, how he had plans and systems in place, and I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I understood how deeply he wanted that to be true. Wanting something to be true doesn't make it so, but it can make you blind to what's holding it together. I felt a small ache in my chest, awe not because I was excited about what he didn't see, but because I knew how hard the realization would be when it finally arrived. There are lessons no one can teach you directly, they have to unfold on their own in their own time, and this felt like one of them. I remembered all the times I'd stepped in quietly before, smoothing things out, covering gaps, making sure the foundation stayed firm even when he wasn't paying attention. I had done it out of love, never imagining that one day he'd stand there believing the foundation had built itself. Sitting there now, I felt no urge to remind him. that urge had faded, replaced by a calm acceptance that this wasn't my role anymore. He had chosen independence, and independence, I was learning, also means accepting the full shape of reality, not just the parts that feel empowering. I watched his face as he spoke, looking for any sign that he sensed what was missing, but he seemed relaxed, even relieved, like someone who thought they'd finally closed a difficult chapter. I almost sighed out loud then, because chapters don't really close just because we decide they're over. They close when all their consequences have been lived through. I felt a strange tenderness toward him in that moment, a soft sadness mixed with understanding. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't heartless, he was simply unaware, and awareness can't be forced, it arrives when it's ready. I stayed quiet, letting the weight of that realization settle evenly in me. There was no satisfaction in knowing what he didn't, no sense of victory, just a steady awareness that the story was moving forward without my intervention for the first time. He spoke about responsibility as if it were something he had already mastered, and I noticed how confidently he separated himself from anything that tied him back to this room, this family, this history. I wondered if he realized how much of his current stability depended on choices made long before this conversation, choices he'd never had to think about because they'd always been handled for him. The thought didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a deeper way. I felt my breathing slow, my shoulders soften, and I accepted that this was not the moment to speak. This was the moment to wait. Waiting isn't passive when you know exactly what you're waiting for. It's deliberate, it's patient. He finished another long explanation, confident and complete in his own mind, and looked at me again, as if expecting a response, maybe approval, maybe resistance. I gave him neither. I met his gaze calmly and stayed silent. That silence wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, full of memory, full of the knowledge that life has a way of gently correcting assumptions when the time is right. I didn't need to point out what he'd forgotten. Life would do that on its own, in ways far more convincing than words. As he shifted in his seat, clearly believing he had said everything that mattered, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. The thing he hadn't mentioned, the thing he thought was no longer part of his life, was still there, still real, still quietly holding things together. And sooner or later he would feel its absence. Not as punishment, not as revenge, but as truth. And when that moment came, this conversation, this silence would take on a meaning he couldn't see yet. I stayed still, listening to the quiet after his words, knowing that the next change wouldn't come from anything I said, but from what would happen when his confidence finally met the reality he had overlooked. After he finished speaking, something subtle happened in the room, something so quiet that you could almost miss it if you weren't paying attention. Sigh, the air changed. It wasn't dramatic. No one gasped, no one stood up. But the stillness shifted, like everyone suddenly became aware that the ground had moved just a little beneath their feet. I felt it first in the way the others avoided his eyes now, not just mine. Earlier, their silence had felt like shock. Now it felt like uncertainty. I noticed him noticing it too, even if he didn't fully understand what it meant yet. He straightened his back slightly, cleared his throat again, and repeated himself in a different way, as if saying the same thing twice might make it stronger. That's often how doubt enters, disguised as confidence. I stayed quiet, watching this new layer unfold, my calm no longer just a choice but a settled state. Inside, there was no rush, no urge to act. I had moved past that. I could sense that he was beginning to realize something wasn't landing the way he expected. Silence can be unsettling when you expect resistance. He shifted in his seat, glanced briefly at someone else in the room, then back at me, and for the first time his eyes lingered just a bit longer, searching. Not for forgiveness, not yet, more like reassurance. And that awe that told me more than all his speeches combined. I felt a soft ache in my chest because reassurance used to be something I gave without thinking. It was almost instinctive. Now I let the moment breathe. I let him sit with the uncertainty he'd created. He tried to explain himself again, this time with less structure, less confidence, his words overlapping slightly, as if he was filling the space rather than making a point. I could hear the change in his voice, subtle but real. It wasn't panic. It was awareness beginning to tap on the door. I watched how his hands moved now, how his posture wasn't as relaxed, how his certainty needed more effort to maintain. The room seemed to notice too. Someone shifted uncomfortably, someone else looked at the floor again. The silence between his sentences grew longer. I sat there, steady, breathing slowly, my face calm, my heart heavy but grounded. I wasn't enjoying this, that's important. There was no satisfaction in seeing his confidence wobble, just a quiet understanding that this is what happens when words are spoken without fully seeing their weight. He had expected a reaction from me, some emotional response that would confirm his position. Tears would have made him feel justified, anger would have made him feel attacked, even arguing would have kept him in control. But this was different. This left him alone with his own words. I could almost hear his thoughts racing now, trying to measure what my silence meant. Did it mean I agreed? Did it mean I didn't care? Did it mean something worse? I didn't clarify, I didn't owe him that clarity anymore. For once, I allowed him to feel the discomfort of not knowing. I remembered how often I'd rushed to ease his discomfort in the past, smoothing over awkward moments, filling gaps, explaining things away so he wouldn't feel uneasy. Sitting there now, I realized how rarely I'd allowed him to sit with uncertainty, and how necessary that sitting can be. He tried to regain control by sounding practical, talking about logistics, about how things would work from now on, and that's when I saw it clearly. He was starting to feel the edge of reality pressing in. His words had shifted from declarations to planning, from emotion to structure, and that told me he was beginning to sense that this decision wasn't just symbolic. It had shape. It had consequences. I felt a slow exhale leave my body, a quiet release, not of relief but of acceptance. This was no longer just a conversation about feelings. It was becoming a moment of reckoning, even if he didn't fully see it yet. The room stayed quiet, almost respectful now, like everyone understood that something irreversible had been set in motion. I looked at him gently, not with accusation, not with judgment, but with clarity, and for a brief second our eyes met in a way they hadn't before. His confidence flickered. Just for a moment, that flicker told me everything. He was starting to understand that this silence wasn't empty, that it wasn't surrender. It was distance forming, real distance, the kind you can't talk your way out of once it's there. I stayed still, letting that understanding grow in him at its own pace, because some realizations can't be rushed. And as he paused again, clearly feeling the shift but not yet naming it, I knew we were getting close to the moment where words would stop being enough, and where what he had said would finally begin to show its true cost. It didn't happen all at once, the cost of his words, sigh, it never does. It started quietly in the small pauses between his thoughts, in the way his voice no longer carried the same ease it had at the beginning. He began to notice details he hadn't noticed before, like how no one rushed to agree with him, how no one filled the silence the way they usually did. I could see him recalculating, adjusting his posture, choosing his words more carefully now, and that told me something important had shifted inside him. This wasn't the confident declaration he had imagined. This was starting to feel real. He spoke again, but this time there was an edge of hesitation, like he was testing the ground before putting his full weight on it. I stayed still, my calm no longer a decision but a settled truth. I wasn't bracing myself anymore, I was watching. And as I watched, I could almost feel the moment when understanding began to press against him, not loudly, not cruelly, but persistently. He started talking about how things would change practically, about how we wouldn't be involved anymore, about how he'd handle things himself, and that's when I noticed the smallest crack in his certainty. He hesitated just a fraction of a second before finishing a sentence. That hesitation spoke louder than anything else he'd said. It was the sound of someone realizing they may have underestimated the weight of their choice. I felt a soft sadness move through me, awe because I knew what was coming, even if he didn't yet. When you remove yourself from something you've always leaned on, you don't feel the absence immediately. You feel it when you reach out and nothing is there. He was still speaking as if everything would stay the same, just without me in it, and that assumption hovered in the air, fragile and untested. I didn't challenge it, I let it float there. I let reality prepare its own response. The room had grown heavier now, the silence thicker, like everyone sensed that this conversation had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He glanced around again, this time not for approval but for grounding, and when he didn't find it, I saw the first real flicker of doubt in his eyes. It wasn't fear, it was something quieter, uncertainty. I watched him swallow hard, adjust his tone again and try to sound firm, but the effort was visible now. His words were no longer flowing, they were being managed. I felt my chest tighten slightly, not in pain, but in recognition of a familiar pattern. This was the moment when consequences begin to feel possible, when confidence starts to brush up against the edges of reality. I remembered times in the past when I'd stepped in at moments like this, offering reassurance, softening the landing, reminding him that everything would be okay. Sitting there now, I resisted that instinct. Not out of cruelty, but out of respect for his choice. He had chosen this path. Letting him walk it without interference was the most honest thing I could do. He spoke again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if hoping that clarity would return if he just explained himself better. But clarity doesn't come from repetition. It comes from facing what your words have set in motion. I could see him starting to connect pieces, realizing that what he'd framed as a clean break was, in fact, a separation with real weight. The room felt smaller somehow, like the walls had drawn closer, amplifying every breath, every pause. I felt my eyes sting again and I blinked slowly, letting the feeling pass without turning it into tears. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about him understanding what independence truly asks of you. He finished another sentence and stopped, longer than before, clearly waiting now, not commanding the moment but hoping someone would help carry it. No one did. And in that quiet, the cost of his sentence finally began to settle, not as punishment, not as drama, but as awareness. I watched as his shoulders tensed slightly, the confidence he'd worn so easily at the start now requiring effort to maintain. I could almost hear his thoughts racing, recalculating, trying to fit this new feeling into the story he'd told himself. That's when it became clear to me that the sentence he'd spoken so confidently earlier had already changed things in ways he couldn't undo. Words don't just express decisions, they create them. And as the silence stretched on, heavy and honest, I knew that what he was beginning to feel was only the first echo of a truth that would follow him long after this room, long after this moment. When he finally looked at me again, really looked, it wasn't the same look he'd given me at the beginning. There was something different there now, something quieter, less certain. His eyes didn't hold that practiced confidence anymore. They searched, and that alone told me the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as he had believed. The room felt even more silent than before, if that was possible, like everyone understood that this was a different moment, not about speeches or explanations, but about recognition. I met his gaze calmly, not with anger, not with disappointment, just with presence, and I saw his breath catch slightly, like he hadn't expected that. Sometimes people prepare themselves for tears or shouting, but they don't know what to do with steadiness. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, the words apparently not ready yet. That pause was heavy, awe heavier than anything he'd said so far. I could almost feel the shift inside him, the slow realization that this wasn't going the way he'd imagined. His voice, when it finally came, was softer, less certain, and I noticed how carefully he chose his words now, like each one needed permission before leaving his mouth. He didn't apologize, not yet. But the sharp edge was gone, replaced by something closer to confusion. He asked a question, small and almost casual on the surface, about how things would work from here, but underneath it was something else entirely. It was a question about safety, about what he could still rely on, and that question landed quietly between us unanswered. I felt my throat tighten for a moment, and I had to swallow before I could breathe comfortably again, not because I wanted to cry, but because I was holding back years of instinct, years of stepping in immediately to reassure him. That instinct rose up fast, familiar and strong, and for a second I almost gave in to it. Almost, but then I remembered everything that had been said, everything that had been decided, and I let the instinct pass. I didn't rush to fill the space, I didn't rescue the moment, I just stayed where I was, calm, attentive, listening. The look on his face changed again, subtle but clear, as he realized I wasn't going to respond the way I always had. There was a flicker of something like panic, quickly masked, followed by a forced steadiness that didn't quite hold. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, and tried again, this time framing his words more carefully, more gently, as if testing a different approach. I could hear the effort in his voice, and it made my chest ache in a way that surprised me, because even now, even after everything, a part of me still wanted to ease his discomfort. That's the strange thing about love. It doesn't disappear just because boundaries are drawn. It lingers quietly, even when it hurts. I looked at him and saw not just the man he was trying to be, but the child he once was, standing there unsure, waiting for guidance. And for a brief, painful moment, I wondered if this was the moment he realized what he had risked losing. His eyes softened just slightly, and I saw regret trying to form, not fully there yet, but close, like a word on the tip of the tongue. He didn't say it, instead he sighed, a real sigh this time, not controlled, not calculated, and that sound alone felt like a crack in the wall he'd built. The room seemed to breathe with him, everyone sensing that something fragile had surfaced. I felt a tear escape then, slow and warm, and I didn't bother to hide it, not as a message, just as truth. He noticed it, and his gaze dropped for a second before lifting again, heavier now. That was when I knew he understood, at least partially, that this wasn't just about saying something bold or drawing a line. It was about what those words had done. The silence between us stretched again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of realization, full of things left unsaid, full of the weight of choice. I stayed quiet, giving him space to feel it without interference, because some understandings need silence to take root. And as he stood there, no longer speaking, no longer certain, I sensed that the next moment wouldn't be about what he wanted or expected, but about what he was finally beginning to see. By the time everything went quiet again, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel tense but heavy, I understood something I hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't a story about him choosing to leave. It was a story about me choosing not to chase. That difference matters more than people realize. I sat there, feeling the weight of the moment settle into my bones, and instead of breaking, something inside me straightened, not in pride. In clarity, I realized that family isn't something you can erase with one sentence, but it is something you can damage when you speak without care. And once damage is done, it doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like two people sitting in the same room, finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. I didn't feel angry. That surprised me. I felt tired, yes, and sad in a deep, honest way. Oh, but I also felt calm. Calm in a way that only comes when you stop fighting reality and start accepting it. I looked at him and understood that whatever happened next wouldn't be shaped by arguments or explanations. It would be shaped by choices lived out over time. Words had brought us here, but only actions would carry us forward. I thought about everything I had learned in that room without saying a single word. I learned that love doesn't protect you from being hurt. It teaches you how to survive it with dignity. I learned that silence, when chosen consciously, can be stronger than any speech. And I learned that letting someone finish talking doesn't mean you agree with them. Sometimes it means you're strong enough to hear the truth without needing to control it. I felt another tear fall, quiet and slow, and I didn't feel embarrassed by it. Tears don't always mean loss. Sometimes they mean release. I realized I had spent so many years defining myself by what I gave, by how useful I was, by how much I could hold together for others, that I had forgotten to ask who I was without that role. Sitting there calm and silent, I met that version of myself for the first time in a long while, and she wasn't weak. She wasn't empty, she was whole. I understood then that if he ever came back with regret or questions or apologies, that would be his journey, not mine. I wouldn't rush to rewrite this moment to make it easier for him to carry. He would have to carry it himself. That wasn't cruelty, that was respect for his choice. Family, I realized, isn't proven by words spoken in comfort. It's revealed by how you treat each other when things are uncomfortable, when loyalty costs something, when listening hurts, when silence is heavy. I stood up slowly, feeling the room watch me, not with fear now, but with something closer to understanding. I didn't say anything dramatic, I didn't make a speech, I didn't need to, my calm said enough. I left that moment knowing that whatever he had tried to take away from me with his words, he couldn't take my sense of self. He couldn't take the years of love I had already lived. He couldn't take my ability to choose peace over chaos. And that knowledge felt grounding, like standing on solid ground after a long storm. If you've ever been told you were no longer needed, no longer wanted, no longer family, I want you to hear this, softly, honestly. Someone else's decision does not erase your worth. You don't have to prove your value by reacting, by begging, by explaining your pain. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is exactly what I did. Listen, let them finish, and then choose yourself. If stories like this speak to you, if they remind you of moments you've lived or feelings you've carried quietly, you're not alone in that. You can subscribe to this channel for more real, honest stories about family, boundaries, and quiet strength. And remember this long after this story ends, the sentence that costs someone everything isn't always spoken in anger. Sometimes it's spoken calmly. And sometimes the greatest power you'll ever hold is knowing when to stay silent and when to walk away with your dignity intact.